Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Filter. On this show, we recognize that the world can be a confusing place to live in. And so what I seek to do on this show is to equip you to live with biblical clarity in our confusing world so that you can face the chaos of life with wisdom, integrity, and courage. For decades, Christians in China have been oppressed and persecuted by a communist state. In spite of this opposition, the underground church there has continued to grow and thrive. We frequently hear the stories of their persecutions and courage, but it's a rare privilege to get to learn from the leaders of the Chinese church. That's why I am so excited about a new book coming out called Faithful Disobedience, and the opportunity in this episode to get to talk to the editor of this book, Hannah Nation. In this conversation, we learn about some of the leaders of the Chinese House Church movement and also about what they believe and teach. Hannah Nation is the managing director of the Center for House Church Theology. A writer and student of missions history and world Christianity, she is inspired by this historical moment and the privilege of witnessing a new chapter in church history unfold across China. Before we get into this episode, let me remind you, if you have not yet already, to subscribe to our email list so that you don't miss out on any new content that we have coming out. Just click the link in the description below to go to the show notes, and you can sign up for the email list on my website. Also, be sure that you're subscribed to Filter wherever you get your podcasts so that you don't miss out on any future episodes that we release. Just subscribe to Filter wherever you get your podcasts, whether that be YouTube, Apple, or Spotify, so that you can make sure you get all those episodes. Lastly, if you were helped by this episode or any of the other content that we put out, it would greatly help us if you leave Filter a rating and review and share this show with your friends. Leave Filter a 5-star rating on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and also write a review on Apple Podcasts. Whenever you take these simple steps, it only takes a minute of your time, but it greatly helps us to get the message of biblical clarity out to more people. Well, without any further delay, let's jump into this conversation that I got to have with Hannah Nation. Hannah, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm glad to have you on. I've been really looking forward to getting to meet you and talk about this book ever since I saw it coming up on IVP's publishing calendar. And so glad to have you on today. Let's get started by just talking about your history and how you got to where you are today working with the Center for House Church Theology.
Yeah. Well, it has definitely been a long and winding road. Not something that I necessarily anticipated doing throughout my life. But this is where the Lord has brought me. I first went to China in 2005. I went really almost on a whim. I had a lot of friends who went to various places because they had kind of had a lifelong interest in it. I really hadn't, but I had some friends from college who had gone and taught English the summer before, and I heard all about their experiences. And then I had my dad is a professor at a large university in the sciences, and he had a Chinese grad student who became a Christian around the same time. So all of a sudden I had these things happening, and I just got really curious, and I thought, I'd like to see the Great Wall, and maybe I'll go teach English too. So I went, and it's just a huge country with a huge population. And I got there and I realized, wow, I know nothing about this place. There's a whole world here that I know nothing about. I've never had any experiences with. And I knew the church was growing rapidly, and it just blew me away, thinking about how it seemed so tangible how much the next chapter of church history is being written there today. And it just captivated me. And basically over the next 20 years almost, I have continued to be involved in serving and ministering to Chinese in different ways. But about 5 years ago, I became involved with efforts to kind of reverse the flow of blessing and working to translate and publish theology and preaching from the Chinese house churches for the global church, really just out of the belief that what the Lord is doing there and what our Chinese brothers and sisters are talking about and writing about not only is encouraging for them and beneficial for them, but that it can be a great encouragement to churches outside of China as well.
Interesting. So you're primarily translating from Chinese to English to publish their resources and what's going on here. But if I heard you right, are you also publishing resources to be used in China as well?
So I'm not involved with that. I have coworkers or people that I'm connected to who do work with resources for the Chinese church. Okay. But my focus is really bringing content out from China for the rest of the world. And we do that. It's with a group called the Center for House Church Theology. And we're essentially a group of Chinese and, Western scholars and writers who are working on this project to share Chinese voices with the global church.
Interesting. So I'm guessing one of the products of the work that you guys are doing is the book that we're talking about today called Faithful Disobedience.
Correct. Yep.
But what else do you guys do? Like, if people are interested in finding the resources that y'all are making, do you have other books, or are you publishing articles, videos?
Yeah. So we have published several articles. These are translations of articles written by Chinese pastors or scholars. They are free on our website, and they cover a range of topics. Some of them have talked about themes very similar to Faithful Disobedience, themes along political theology or public theology. But also we've published essays on very different topics, such as gender or things like contextualization and worldview. So we have quite an interesting range. We've published, I think, about 8 articles. We will be coming out with more next year. But we also do publish books. Faithful Disobedience is our second book. We published a book earlier this year called Faith in the Wilderness, and that is it's pretty different from Faithful Disobedience. It's a much more lay level book that I would say anyone could pick up and use in a church small group or college Bible study. And it's a collection of sermons from pastors preached through the most intense parts of the 2020 pandemic. And it touches on a lot of themes of just suffering and the hope that we have in redemption as we experience suffering. So, so we're poised to probably be publishing at least one book per year moving forward. We have a lot of content that we're excited to bring out from China and share with the rest of the world.
Yeah, awesome. Well, for anyone who's listening and wanting to check out some of those resources, I'll have all of that you just mentioned linked in the show notes. So just go down to the link in the description and go to the show notes, and you can find the book, website, and so on. But let's talk about Faithful Disobedience, this one that's coming out here in a couple of weeks. Tell us just about the background of this book, not just in terms of your editorial work getting it out, but the occasions that led to the content of the book.
Yeah. So Faithful Disobedience is a collection of writings most of which come from a pastor named Wang Yi. He is a Reformed pastor in Southwest China. He himself is a very interesting person. Before he became a Christian, he was a very prominent human rights lawyer and legal scholar in China. And he essentially became a Christian in the early 2000s, and very soon after that became involved in pastoring and leading a house church called Early Rain. And Wang Yi, even before he became a Christian, he had a very active mind, very active writer, especially online. A lot of writing takes place online in China. And when he became a Christian, he didn't stop writing. He really just turned his intellectual abilities to thinking through the application of the gospel to all sorts of different things, but definitely to the question of the house church in China, and just really the legal and political state of the house church in China. He has been very outspoken on his positions, and some would consider him too outspoken on his positions. That, of course, is, a matter that's up for debate and is highly debated within China and the Chinese house churches. But probably one of the most notable things about Wang Yi is that in 2018, he was arrested, and his entire church was essentially shut down. In December of 2018, there was a very large orchestrated attack on the church. The church's property was confiscated. All of the leadership of the church was arrested and held at length, and then kind of ongoing for several weeks. Roughly half of the church's members faced either arrest or harassment of some kind. Wang Yi has been sentenced to 9 years in jail. This is the longest jail sentence given to a house church pastor in several decades. So it's very notable. He was arrested for subversion of the state, which is a political charge, and it's a very severe charge. And so he remains incarcerated. There is not a whole lot of information about his well-being and how he's doing. It has been reported that his wife was able to visit him for the first time last year. But obviously, he remains held and in need of prayer. This book came about. There's a long story behind how this book came about. So we, had already been involved in translating what we considered noteworthy things that he was writing, and working to publish them. But before his arrest, even, we came to understand that he had compiled something that he called his House Church Manifesto. Yeah. This was a collection of writings, not only his own writings, but writings of other prominent house church pastors in China, mostly from Beijing. And he put these writings together into what he called this manifesto. And it's basically just a long discussion of why these churches desire to remain house churches rather than becoming part of the Chinese state church. One thing that a lot of people don't understand about Christianity in China is that there is an official above-the-ground state church. Not all churches are house churches in China. And there's been this long ongoing debate really about whether the house churches should join the state church or not. It became clear that Wang Yi wanted this manifesto to be published and to be shared beyond China. And we started thinking about how that might be done. But eventually we realized we had enough writings of his translated that they really, we could make a bigger book than just this shorter manifesto. And so we compiled all of these writings that really explain who he is, his positions on the role of the church in society, and we put them together as a book.
Yeah, interesting. Can you help us to understand, 'cause I think this goes to understanding and appreciating the book, is help us to understand what kind of religious activities are allowed in China today, and just what is the environment like in China today versus what it was like in, more Maoist China and so on. So how that's changed over the decades.
Yeah, that's a really important question. So obviously, the history of Christianity in China is very complicated, very complex. But today in China, estimates are that the low end numbers that you'll hear are that there are 70 to 80 million Christians in China. The higher estimates are, well above 100 million Christians. That's a lot of people. That's a very large church. And even as a percentage of the Chinese population, that's significant because it's probably hovering somewhere around 5% of the population, which is often a very important percentage missiologically. So as a baseline for understanding Christianity in China, it's important to understand that we're not talking about a small church. We're not talking about a church that is, numerically insignificant. This is a pretty large church at this point. Politically, in China, there is what would be called freedom of religion. There is not necessarily an effort to eradicate all spiritual practice or religious belief in China today. Those are things that definitely occurred, especially at the height of the Cultural Revolution. But today, no one is necessarily trying to weed out religious life from China. The kind of burning question that exists for all religions in China is their relationship to the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and in essence, their relationship with the political realities and rulers of China. The CCP is not opposed to people having religious belief, but they are opposed to anything that challenges their authority in China, and challenges what they would consider to be the political and social cohesion and unity of China. And so it's not hard to go from there to seeing why religious practice often feels threatening for the CCP. And then you could also guess maybe is threatening at times to the CCP. This is why you will see such harsh crackdowns on not just Christianity and the churches, but various other religions as well. For example, the Uyghurs, a lot of the conflict there is not necessarily strictly religious, but it's a conflict over authority and cultural unity. So one of the ways in which the CCP has tried to allow for religious life in China, but yet maintain its authority and its control, is by establishing state regulated or state sanctioned churches or affiliations for different religions. So there is a state-affiliated Catholic structure and there is a state-affiliated Protestant structure. And what birthed the house churches in China all the way back in the 1950s was essentially a rejection of participating in the state church. And that has fueled a long-lasting debate between the state churches and the house churches. And that is exactly the debate that Wang Yi speaks to so much in his book is it acceptable to have a state church? Is it acceptable to allow the governing authorities to have any or varying amounts of authority over the church? And his book addresses those questions, essentially.
Yeah, so the state-sanctioned church is called the Three Self-Patriotic Movement. Can you help us to understand what that is? The name itself is so strange to any of us who are not familiar with it. So just what is that all about, and how does this state-sanctioned church operate?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So the Three Self-Patriotic Movement, or the acronym you'll hear is TSPM. Again, this was birthed in the 1950s, right after the communists came to power. And even though it's a very unusual name for maybe American ears, I think the three selves that it's referring to are not things that we would necessarily say, oh, those are bad ideas. They reference a much older missiological principle that churches should be self-governed, self-funded, and self-propagating. And this was really so much of the momentum for something like the Three Self Church was really in reaction to the history of Western missions in China prior to the 1950s. And across the board, theologically, whether they were in more liberal-leaning theological churches or more conservative, fundamentalist-influenced churches within China, in the first half of the 20th century, there was just a lot of movement to separate the churches, the Chinese churches, indigenous churches, from Western oversight. There was a pretty significant feeling that a lot of the missionary oversight was problematic for a lot of various reasons. And so you have figures like Wang Mingdao, who's considered the father of the house churches, who even well before the communists were in the picture, he was forming an independent church that was completely independent of Western missionaries. But when the communists came in, essentially the Three Self Church was a way to kind of formalize that or codify it, and to say you may not have ties or connections to outside forces. The Chinese church must be for the Chinese only. And it was a way to purge Chinese Christianity of its connections to outsiders, which, even though you could say there were a lot of good, positive reasons for that to happen. There also, obviously, it was a way to cut off ties to the Western world that the communists were suspicious of. So the Three Self Church is, I think, like all state churches, it's very complicated. It does submit to the oversight of the CCP. It is very open in its objectives to have a Christianity that is supportive of or openly patriotic of China and the CCP. And so you'll see a lot of things that, you might see things like Chinese flags in sanctuaries or, the singing of patriotic songs in churches. But you'll also see a lot of things that are faithful to the gospel. It's not necessarily, it's not devoid of the gospel, I would say. Yeah. It's a complicated reality, as any state church is.
Yeah, interesting. So the Communist Party's interest isn't just religious, but also wanting to keep out any Western influences. And that's something that I'd never heard before. I'd always heard that their interest in persecuting Christians was only religious, was only theological, that they wanted to implement an atheistic state. So that's different. That's something that I had never heard before. But with the three selfs statement, self-governing does seem to be undermined by the fact that it's state-sanctioned, right? So, like, exactly how self-governed is the Three Self-Patriotic movement, and how much state influence and oversight is there?
That's a question it would be probably hard for me to answer. I don't consider myself an expert on the Three Self Church. I think in terms of outside influence, that non-Chinese influence, then it would be self-governed fully. It is a very Chinese-led church. It does not have oversight by outside churches in other countries, for example. Mm-hmm. In terms of internally in its relationship with the state, it would be hard for me to give kind of a, half and half, or that kind of answer. I think, especially in China, a lot of things are not transparent. And so I think it probably the best way to say it is that I would think the higher up you go in the Three Self Church, the closer it will be to state authorities. The more local it is, the more localized you're talking, there's probably more independence. Mm-hmm. But that's generally true of most anything in China. That would be true just of, for example, regional governments in China. The local police station, doesn't really necessarily have a direct responsibility to Beijing. But when you're talking about a higher governor or a higher authority, then he'll have closer ties to the central state for sure.
Yeah. But the fact that it is still a state sanction, I'm sure, is what caused Wang Yi to write his manifesto to explain why they choose to be separate. What was his goal, before we really get into the content of his manifesto and of the book? What was his goal in writing it?
Well, I think for Wang Yi, as much as I can speak for him, I think there are two things. he really burns with a desire to see more people know Jesus. He's deeply committed to evangelism. I think the second thing is he really believes in the church as God's primary way of bringing the kingdom of God to earth. And so he is very interested in this question of what is the church and what is it for in our world. And so all of his writings on this topic and all of his conflict with the state church comes down to this question of who's the head of the church, who's the authority over the church, and how does that then infiltrate down to these questions of what is the church for, what are we doing, which ties to his commitment to evangelism. And so in writing the manifesto, I really think, I don't have this necessarily from his lips, but I think that all of the writings in the book, I really think he is writing more to other churches in China than he is necessarily writing to the Communist Party itself, or the state church itself. I think he writes to try to help Christians in China understand who they are and what God has called them to be. And that then involves these other players, so to say, or these other parties. But I think his primary audience is really churches and pastors who he wants to help understand what God has called them to be and what God has made them to be.
Yeah, so it's not similar to like Tertullian's apologetic, the manifesto that he wrote as a defense of Christianity to the persecuting Roman state. This sounds like a lot more similar, and I was getting this feeling when I was reading it. It feels a lot more similar to churches in sort of the Reformation era that were the underground Protestant churches who were being persecuted by this partnership between the Catholic Church and the state, and they were writing their defenses for resistance and their argument for religious liberty.
Yeah, I think it would be somewhere in the middle. I think there's a little bit of both in his writings, because I think, his primary audience and his intended audience is the other churches, but he knows that he's being listened to by the authorities and, by those who would be opposed to him. Yeah. And so he does talk quite a lot, especially in the writings in the latter portions of the book. He talks a lot about persecution as the church's apologetic. And he and many other pastors that I have heard from across China talk about their interrogations or their times before judges as their time to preach the gospel. Wow. So, I think you could even think back maybe to Stephen or the apostles, where these court confrontations, or these confrontations with the authorities and the powers, are used as a time to clarify theology, and to clarify what is believed about the nature of the church. Yeah,
I think that a lot of Christians are unaware of the really deep and long-stretching tradition that exists in Christianity of a resistance theory, and of talking about when do we submit to government, when do we not, when is it appropriate to resist, what makes the government legitimate, illegitimate. We see that going all the way back to, like, as you mentioned before, the New Testament and the book of Acts, whenever we see the apostles resisting the rulers by continuing to preach the gospel. We see it in ancient Rome. We see it in, as I said before, throughout the Reformation, in the 20th century, in the underground churches throughout the various Soviet bloc countries. And so this is really a contribution to that long history. And so in Wang Yi's writing, what are his theological justifications for resistance to the state?
Yeah, well, part of what we tried to do in the book is to show some of the evolution of his thinking on this topic. I definitely would say that the earlier writings, the writings that he included in the manifesto, which is the first third of the book, are much more grounded in a lot of traditional, just Western, rights theory, basically. But as he progresses towards 2018 and his arrest, really both his ecclesiology, his understanding of what the church is and his definition of the church, and also, most importantly, his eschatology, his thoughts on where we are going and where we are going as the church, start to influence his thinking on this question far more, I think, than people like John Locke, for example, who is a clear influence. But the closer to 2018 you move, the more these other things become more influential. And essentially, the crux of his position is that the church is called to submit to the state fully, and we disobey when the state is requiring of us something that limits the ability of other people to hear the gospel. So I think the Wang Yi and a lot of the house church pastors really have begun to see the church as the primary gift of God to the cities that they live in. And so when that gift from the Lord is, when the state is trying to stop that gift from the Lord, you could say, it requires them to disobey. And one of the things that there's a statement that Wang Yi makes in his last thing that he wrote before he was arrested. It's called My Declaration of Faithful Disobedience. That's where the title from the book for the book comes from. Mm-hmm. But he makes this statement that what he is doing is not fighting for political rights, but testifying to the reality of another world. And I think that, to me, is very interesting to sit with and mull over, coming out of the tradition of, Western political rights that I come out of, because I think that challenges a lot of our heart disposition for why we do what we do when we disobey. So I think that, people have asked me, do I think he really, is what he's saying really true? Is he really not fighting for political rights? Because it seems like he is, right? But I think that when you read his body of work, which we are asking people to do, this question of testifying to another world and testifying to another reality comes to the forefront. And I think it challenges us because there's the question that it leaves me with is, how much have we fought for political protections for the church for our own comfort, as opposed to wanting them or protecting them for the good of the world, and the ability of the church to be that gift to the city that Wang Yi believes it is and should be. And I think that is, it's something to sit with. It's something to let you and make you feel uncomfortable a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree. I think that is a good question, and it's one that really can get us to check our the order of our affections. And are we primarily driven by a calling from God, driven by the Spirit, or primarily just driven by comfort and fear of losing conveniences? And conveniences are not bad things.
No.
Right. Those are very good things to desire. But yeah, of course, we can become just more selfishly driven by those things than the call of the gospel.
Well, and I think Wang Yi is so influenced by this idea of walking the way of the cross. This is a term that you hear quite a lot in the house churches. It goes back to the first generation of house church fathers in the 1950s. And they're very bold in saying that the Christian's call is to walk the way of the cross with our Lord. And because Jesus suffered in this life on earth, we are called to participate in that suffering. And I think that has to be kept in mind when thinking about his disobedience, because again, it comes down to this question of what is the motivation? What is this for? If it is to escape the life of the cross, then that, I think Wang Yi would be very bold in saying that's a wrong motivation. That's an incorrect motivation. But if it's out of an understanding that we walk the same path with Christ, and whether you end up in jail for 9 years or not, Christ calls you to suffer with him. I think that gets closer to the motivations that he's talking about and the motivations he wants others to consider.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so often the temptation to not walk the way of the cross is going to look like just complying with a government that tells us to go against the gospel or go against Scripture, or to defy what we believe, and to just comply with it. And so this resistance that he's shown and that others in China are showing, that we've seen in other places in the world, is walking the way of the cross. One of the things that you see whenever you read the writings of people who have tried to work out resistance theory throughout the ages and in different places, they always try to figure out the problem of when to resist and when not to, right? Because you can see all kinds of infringements on just liberties that we ought to have in life whenever you live in a totalitarian state. But you have to pick and choose when is appropriate to resist and when not to. It would be foolish and not help the gospel at all to just resist to everything. So how do they work that out in their house churches and in their writings and thinking?
Yeah, well, I will, say again, Wang Yi does maintain that Christians are called to submit to the ruling authorities pretty extensively. He states very clearly that his goal is not to overthrow the regime or to change laws even. But he does believe his call is to speak prophetically regarding, in his words, the wicked that is done by a government. And so, I can read a quote. He says, let's see. The calling that I have received requires me to use nonviolent methods to disobey those human laws that disobey the Bible and God. My Savior, Jesus Christ, also requires me to joyfully bear all costs for disobeying wicked laws. And so he is committed to nonviolence, but at the same time, this is where that understanding of the cross comes in. He believes that his call is to maintain the church and to maintain the church at all costs. But he also believes that it is his call to accept the costs of maintaining the church at all costs. With that, a commitment to doing so nonviolently. And so that is, I think, an exceptionally hard position to take. And, obviously he is receiving, the full extent in many ways. He's being tested on that as we speak. So
yeah, you said before that there are some in the House Church movement in China who thought that he was too outspoken in debates on that. Is that a part of this debate on when to resist, when not to resist, how much is too much resistance, to where you're actually hurting the greater cause?
Yeah, I think so. For most of the history of the house church, the house churches have been very, very quiet. They have not necessarily spoken out publicly. They've, essentially from the birth of the house churches through, for sure, the Cultural Revolution, until relatively recently, the house churches were very hidden. They weren't necessarily in the public square talking about their theological positions on the state. A lot of those things really started to change with, especially the movement from, for the first many decades, the house churches were mostly in the rural areas, beginning in the 1990s until today. The demographics are changing significantly, and the house churches grew rapidly in the urban centers of China. They've also been growing among educated thinkers. And so theology has just become, I would say the house churches have always been theological. There's no church that's not theological somehow. But they have become much more theologically engaged and productive. And so part of that has involved, theologizing and writing and speaking more publicly on these things. I think a lot of people struggle with that. A lot of people struggle with taking a kind of public position on these things. The kind of common allegation against Wang Yi is that he was poking the bear. And so a lot of people would say it's needless. You don't have to poke the CCP. So, and he, in many places, replies and says, that this is what is called of some people. I think very interestingly, he is very aware that this calling is not for all of the churches across China, all of the pastors across China. In fact, there's one really interesting interview that he gave in which he basically says that he believes the large churches, house churches in China, his church had over 500 people attending before it was shut down. These kind of larger house churches when they are public and when they are bolder, they kind of can protect their public nature protects the smaller churches in riskier areas. It would be interesting to see if his thinking on that has changed at all. Those statements were made obviously before his arrest and the dismantling of his church, but it's an interesting thought just thinking about his interest in being public for the good of smaller churches. And he talks about it as taking the heat. They'll take the heat so that it's not put onto other smaller churches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. And once again, it's something that's not uncommon if you read a history of resistance theory in the church, or even of the larger resistance to communism in Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet countries. There's always a discussion among those who are in the underground over where do we poke, where do we not poke, when is it better to just keep your head down? Because I think we Americans can kind of get like a real cowboy attitude and
yes,
and think that no, you never put your head down, you're never quiet, you always poke and fight and stand up for your rights. And okay, it's a good sentiment, but it's very different from the reality of living these situations. And they understand that there's times that you can actually you can be counterproductive and do more harm than good and for your local community and the greater movement. So yeah, really interesting. Speaking of where we are, what do you think Americans can learn from the example of Wang Yi, the others who write in this book, and from reading a book like Faithful Disobedience?
Yeah, I love that question. It's one I think about a lot. Well, I think there are two things I'll say. I think, for me personally, I think just everything that he talks about regarding the Christian's call to suffer with Christ has really just started to influence me quite a lot in recent years. I think that it's just not something you hear talked a lot about in the U.S. In the Western world. We're very averse to suffering. We're very averse to that being a part of our calling. And I think that we talk a lot about the cross and we talk a lot about bearing the cross. But I think we need our brothers and sisters from parts of the world where that is a very prominent reality in their lives, to help us understand what that really means and to really dig into some of that. I think with regards to the relationship to the state, I really think just this commitment to all disobedience, all resistance, essentially being about testifying to the gospel and the reality of the kingdom of God is deeply challenging. And I think that it's a helpful thing for us to have a perspective that says, even when you do poke the bear, even when you do resist, you are called to do it for the good of others, not for the protection of yourself and not for the protection of your own rights. I think that is really challenging to a Western perspective on these things. We are so quick to protect our rights simply for the sake of protecting ourselves, I think. And the house churches that I listen to, they're so committed to understanding things like civil disobedience is something that's done for the good of others. It's not done for the protection of themselves. And so I think that's just, that is very different from a lot of things that I think are influential today. And it gets to our hearts, right? It kind of takes us out of this realm of talking about political rights and political theory on a very theoretical level, and a very systematic level, and it brings it down to this heart level that I think is really needed. I think one of the best examples I can think of how this, works itself out is that so many of the Chinese Christians that I know who have spent time in jail talk about their time in jail as a time to both repent of their own idols and to preach the gospel among people who probably would never hear the gospel otherwise.
Wow.
And I think that's just, I can't think of, I don't know that I would have that perspective if someone came to me today and was going to arrest me for my faith commitments. I think I'd be hard pressed to say my first response would be, okay, this is a time for me to repent of my idols of success and comfort, and to prepare to go preach the gospel to those who have never heard it before and probably wouldn't have the opportunity to otherwise. So,
yeah, that's one of the benefits of reading from these other Christians around the globe who've been in very different circumstances than us. And I do think it's a good question to look at the heart whenever we consider resistance, civil disobedience, or even protest. I think it's good to look at the heart. Because we can very much be driven by selfishness or even by grievances, rather than a real desire for the common good and for the good of the church and of the gospel. And so, I think it's great.
And that's, Wang Yi actually says at one point that if your disobedience is causing your heart to turn to sin, such as, bitterness, selfishness, yada, yada, that is a sign that this is not from the Lord, that true faithful disobedience does not go against the fruits of the Spirit in the individual's heart.
Wow, that's good. Well, there's a lot for us to learn from this book and from the Chinese House Church, and so I'm really thankful for the work that you guys are doing at the center, and also for this book that you'll have coming out. Once again, the title of it is Faithful Disobedience, and it'll be coming out in the next couple of weeks. And I just thank you so much for the work that you've done, and thank you for joining us to talk about it here on Filter today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. I hope this episode provided you with biblical clarity to live with confidence in our confusing world. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To catch up the latest from me, you can go to my website, aaronchamp.com. While you're there, subscribe to my newsletter so that you can be updated anytime I share new content. You can also follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Aaron M. Champ. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Until then, hold fast to the anchor.